Well, they like the icebergs a lot more than everything else. I just don't know what other type of videos they'll like as much. I guess I could just keep doing icebergs. So I'm back with your guys' favorite video. As long as you want to see them, I'm going to keep pumping them out. And I'll take this moment to point you to my other two icebergs, the NFL and NBA variation, if you're interested. But for today, we're talking the good old ball and stick.
God, I love baseball.
Baseball's a special sport. It's historic with customs and traditions that are really rooted in American families. It's also got history and stat keeping that allows us to go to literally the 1870s and see a game pitch by pitch. So I put together every resource I could, and I went through and found the MLB's darkest moments ever. In this iceberg video, I'm going to be going over the MLB's low points. We'll start at the top of the iceberg, unveiling the more known, less serious type things, and just like an iceberg, work our way down to the darkness until we see the most disturbing moments in baseball's history. As always, I've put together my own iceberg, so feel free to use and enjoy. Tippy top. Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds is the most dangerous power hitter in MLB history, and he has stats that really just make you laugh. But Bonds' career has been embroiled in controversy for off-the-field issues, leaving his legacy as a huge question mark. First of all, during Bonds' playing career, he was commonly seen as a self-centered diva-type player, who was just kinda a jerk in his prime with the Pirates and Giants. And this isn't bad, it's actually pretty common in good athletes. But Bonds' real problems began in the early 2000s when steroid accusations came onto him and would never leave. Bonds admitted to using steroids on accident in 1998 because of his trainer misleading him, but for the next few years, court cases would play out trying to find Bonds guilty. Barry Bonds has been blocked from the MLB Hall of Fame and is just one of many steroid-accused players, many of which we'll speak about later. Randy's Bird. It was a spring training game in March of 2001, a pretty meaningless at-bat in the amazing career of Randy Johnson. Johnson was pitching and fired his signature fastball towards home plate. Keep in mind, this guy was known for throwing above 100 miles per hour consistently. So, when the pitch hit a poor, passing bird, you can understand how the bird literally exploded into a puffy array of feathers on live television. The incident immediately became iconic, with the 1 in a million video going viral. Cubs curse. The Chicago Cubs are one of the oldest franchises in the MLB, and they had a ton of success in their first few decades of existence. But long ago, in 1908, they won the World Series. Then they stopped winning, for a long time. The 1945 World Series, Cubs fans would suffer their worst day in team history. A local Greek, William Sionis, who owned the Billy Goat Tavern, was a known man in Chicago. But when he tried to get into the Cubs World Series game, bringing his signature Billy Goat for good luck, he was denied at the entrance. Workers didn't allow him to bring his mascot in, and he ended up in an argument with Cubs owner P.K. Wrigley. After Wrigley turned him away, the man threw up his arms and said the Cubs will never again win a World Series. They were cursed. 1945 was the last World Series they made, and for 71 long years, the Chicago Cubs went through baseball hell, enduring countless painful moments as a poverty MLB franchise. But finally, in 2016, they broke out of one of the sport's worst curses when they won the World Series. The only question is, will it be 108 more? Through the legs. It's one of the most iconic blunders in sports history. Such a simple, easy error, but so much weighing on it. The Red Sox were up 3-2 in the World Series, being able to clinch it with one more win. And in the 10th inning, with a man on second, the Yankees hit a slow dribbler right towards Bill Buckner. and right through Bill Buckner it went, scooping under his glove and through his legs. It allowed the run to score, and a Game 7 was forced. The Yankees would win that game as well. With 2 outs in that 10th inning, if Buckner had just fielded the ball and gotten the out, the game would have gone into the 11th inning. A-Rod's suspension. Alex Rodriguez was an electric MLB star, mainly for the Yankees, but his reputation will never recover from what happened in 2014. Rodriguez was found guilty of a major steroid bust in the league, and it was in turn made an example out of. A-Rod picked up the largest steroid-related suspension of all time to that point, missing a full 162 games. Rodriguez doesn't have to worry about it now, and he's not short on the money he missed, but his legacy has an unmovable dent. Surface of the water. Pete Rose. The MLB hit king, Pete Rose, has the very most hits of any player to ever play in the Major League Baseball. But for such an amazing accomplishment, it may come as a shock that Rose is not even in the Hall of Fame. He sits with Barry Bonds on the outside looking in. Rose infamously bet on games including the Cincinnati Reds at the same time he was coaching the team. Many times, including just last year, Rose has come back whining that he wants to be back in the Hall of Fame, and he also insists that he only ever bet on his team to win, so he didn't do anything wrong. So, what do you think? Should he be let in the Hall? Steroid era. Steroids have always been around and used in sports, but in the MLB in the 90s, it was different. No league has ever had the level of open secret as the MLB did, as it seemed everyone in the stadium knew that the players were on steroids. This era was a net negative for the MLB, as the game got less popular and took a big reputation hit. It felt a little dirty for America's pastime to have this going on. It kind of felt like a kid in class was cheating on a presentation and everybody knew. This was highlighted in the 2001 home run race between Bonds and McGwire. I mean, that race was some of the most exciting baseball ever, so you do have to wonder how fun the league would be if we just threw out steroid testing and said, go crazy. Steve Bartman. Remember when I said the Cubs curse had some heartbreaking moments in the club's 108-year title drought? Well, this one was probably the worst. Chicago was in the playoffs, up 3-2 in the NLCS, and just 1 win away from the 2003 World Series. And in the 8th inning, up 3-1, they were just a few outs away from the pennant. This is when a random Cubs fan named Steve Bartman made his name known in infamy. With a fly ball lined towards left, Cubs left fielder Moises Alou tried to make the play. But a barrage of fans reached for the ball, and one of those fans, Steve Bartman, deflected it away from the Cub. Alou threw down his glove in anger and protested for fan interference, but the call stood. With the Cubs up 3-1, they went on to allow 8 runs in that 8th inning. It was a miraculous choke, but it wasn't all Steve Bartman's fault. This kind of brings us into our next layer. Alex Gonzalez error. Now, we're still in that same Cubs game. Steve Bartman's famous play has just occurred, and the Cubs' lead was now at 3-1. This moment is one that's forgotten in baseball history, with all the blame being placed on Steve Bartman. But what many fans forget is how Bartman's play never should have mattered. With 1 out and a runner on first, Alex Gonzalez had a ground ball belted right at him. If he would have turned this into the double play that it should have been, the inning ends, and the Cubs likely go on to the World Series. But instead, against all odds, he bobbled the ball. This tiny window was all the Marlins needed to score 7 more runs and crush the Cubs. It could have been just 95 years. Ray Caldwell. Okay, so this one's straight out of a video game. It defies all reality and belief. It's crazy. So the year's 1919, because I guess cooler stuff just happened a really long time ago. Ray Caldwell suits up for his very first start as an Indians pitcher, but he's a pretty solid veteran. The weather is brutally hot as he throws his warm-up pitches, but as the game progresses, storm clouds start to roll in. Now, in the 9th inning, the storm is about to break wide open. Just 3 more outs to go though, and the Indians will win the game and get off the field. The first 2 batters quickly fly out, leaving us within just 1 out of the game being over. But at that moment, a bright, large flash shoots down from the sky and onto the field. A beam of electric lightning strikes the diamond right in the infield. The Indians' shortstop at the time is Ray Chapman, who we'll be talking about later for different reasons. But right now, he feels a surge of electricity go up his leg, while the team's catcher throws his mask as far as he can to get away from the metal mask. As commotion stops and everyone looks up, all the Indians players are okay, except their new pitcher, Ray Caldwell, who's laying on the ground. The first responders touch his body and is shocked instantly. With Caldwell laying motionless, parties are ready to pronounce him dead from the lightning strike. That is when he wiggles around and gets up, insisting he has to get 1 more out. Chapman, the shortstop who would later suffer the worst on-the-field trauma ever, handed the ball to Caldwell, who got the last out and completed the game. Ray Caldwell completed pitching a baseball game after being struck by lightning. Entering the dark. Black Sox. The Black Sox scandal is the biggest team cheating scandal in sports history. Shockingly, in the same year of 1919, the Chicago White Sox lost the World Series, but it wasn't on accident. The team was accused of throwing the game in a game-fixing gambling scandal, and 8 players were banned for life. Despite appeals in public courts, the ban stood, and the darkest series in MLB history was born. A main player in this case was Shoeless Joe Jackson, who insisted he didn't know anything about the fixing. He still played excellent in the series, but he was never unbanned, despite trying relentlessly. Rafael Palmeiro. Palmeiro was an MLB infielder in the 80s and 90s, and like many others of his time, he was a caught steroid user. But not every single one of them can be on this list, and Palmeiro went the extra mile. In March of 2009, Rafael Palmeiro stood before US Congress and swore that he had never used anabolic steroids. But in May of that same year, you can probably guess what he tested positive for. Palmeiro was in serious danger of being charged with perjury, but escaped with not enough evidence. Manny's second suspension. Manny Ramirez was a veteran outfielder for the Boston Red Sox and was looked up to by millions. But his reputation took a huge hit when he was suspended in 2009 for steroid use. He used this as fuel to get back though, promising his fans it would never happen again and working hard to get back. All the hard work and promises made it all the worse when Manny quickly tested positive for steroids, throwing his MLB reputation to the dirt, where it cannot be recovered. 1989 World Series. In 1989, the A's and the Giants faced off in the World Series for the only time ever, creating the Battle of the Bay. And this series became much more than memorable, but not for baseball reasons. The two California teams' rivalry isn't really as intense as some others, but they went at it for 2 games. But right before Game 3, a little before the first pitch, an enormous earthquake erupted the Bay Area, causing serious damage to the stadium and famously collapsing the Bay Bridge. It was a terrifying moment in baseball's history that suspended the game. Eventually, the A's went on to sweep the Giants, winning the World Series. But almost eerily, it's said that the Battle of the Bay taking place at that time likely saved thousands of lives, with so many people off the roads either at the stadium or at home watching the game. It's kind of creepy to think about. Spooky Body of the Berg. Marge Scott. Some of you may have been lucky enough to catch my NBA Iceberg before it was age restricted. And if you did, you know Donald Sterling. Well, Marge Scott is basically the MLB's Donald Sterling. A racist, bad fit, terrible person who just so happened to somehow become owner of a pro team. The Cincinnati Reds were the unfortunate victim of her wrath, but let's just skip to her awesome and much deserved downfall. In the early 90s, a fired Reds coach sued Scott, saying that he was fired for opposing her policy to not hire African Americans. She denied the claim, but later went on to refer to colored Reds players as $1 million. After dropping the N-word a few more times, she was suspended for just a year. I would assume, like everyone else, she was amazed that she only got a year for this, and came back with a vengeance. Scott was going to come back with something that deserved much more than a year. In a real 1996 interview with ESPN, Marge Scott praised a political figure. And who do you think it was? Maybe Abe Lincoln? MLK? Marge Scott praised Hitler. And I already know what you're thinking. No, Kanye, get out of here. I think the league is a better place since she was forced to sell the team. Good riddance. Merkel's boner. Any females who may have watched to this point, put it back in your pants. Boner means blunder. Fred Merkel was a very young prospect for the Giants, way back in 1908. Now, the story's about as crazy as you'd expect a 115-year story to be. It's a tie game, bottom of the ninth, 2 outs. Fred Merkel stands in the box with a runner on first, and he hits a huge single into right field, but the batter isn't able to score. Runners are on the corners, with Merkel manning first base. The next at-bat is a bomb into deep center field. It drops into the outfield, and the winning run comes in from third. New York Giant fans rush the field to celebrate the walk-off win. Pandemonium ensues. But Cubs second baseman Johnny Evers sees a huge opportunity. Fred Merkel, who was on first base, never tagged second. The 19-year-old saw the run score and turned to celebrate with his team and fans. This is where things start to get dicey. There's various accounts of what happened next, but somehow Johnny Evers got a baseball. Some say he tricked Giants players for the game ball, some say he stole a random ball from a fan, and some think he ran into the clubhouse and rubbed a new ball in some dirt to make it look legit. Either way, Johnny Evers found Merkel in the commotion and tagged him out with some baseball. Umpires somehow ruled this a legit out, and the game was over with no run, thanks to the force out rule. Usually, baseball goes to extra innings when tied, but with fans having stormed the field, they called the game and rescheduled for a different time, which the Giants ended up losing, cementing Merkel's boner as an all-time mistake. Disco Demolition. Disco Demolition Night was a promotion for a 1979 doubleheader game between the White Sox and the Tigers, but it turned into an all-out, disco-fueled rampage. The premise of the game was that for just 98 cents, you could come to the game with a disco record and turn it in at the gate. In between games of the doubleheader though, the disco company was going to blow up these records in an explosion spectacle right on the field. The promise of an explosion drew thousands of fans, way more than the stadium could hold, and people began sneaking in all over the stadium. Many fans who got in without going through the gate still had their records, which they would then promptly throw onto the field. But after the first game, the explosion actually went off, and it was huge. It tore up the entire field, and it caused the second game to be cancelled. But after the explosion, the overpacked stadium burst onto the field in a riot that took police and SWAT teams to break up. Belche Cameron. Carlos Beltran and Mike Cameron were teammates on the New York Mets in the early 2000s, and the two were involved in one of the scariest on-the-field plays ever. It was a 2005 game against the Padres, and David Ross had just hit a blooper pop-up into the shallow outfield. And this is the play coaches should use to tell their players to always call out who has the ball. The right and center fielder collided head-on dangerously, sending both of them out of the game and Beltran to the hospital. Luckily, neither of them had any lasting injuries, but it's an ugly sight. Wild foul ball. In 2019, the Astros and Cubs were facing off in Houston when a 1 in a million chance ended terribly. Every baseball game, you're knowingly taking the risk to get hit by a fly ball, but with all the netting, it's usually not a huge issue. However, with how fast some guys can hit the ball off the bat, some sad things can happen. The Cubs were up to bat and lined a casual foul ball down right field. But somehow, that foul ball managed to strike a 2-year-old girl in the head straight on, throwing Cubs players and fans into a tear of worry. Sadly, the girl's thought to have permanent brain damage from the incident. It's a tough situation, and it's scary because it could literally happen to anyone at any time. It really is random. The darkness. Landis prevents integration. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was an old MLB commissioner who the MVP trophies were named after for a long time. But Landis has a dark, sort of open secret in that he did everything he possibly could to keep baseball's color barrier. He did not at all want integration in the MLB, and it never happened under his 24 years of being commissioner until he died. After many past winners of the MVP, including Barry Larkins, spoke up in anger of his name being on the plaque, it was finally removed. The commissioner was never found to be an outright racist, and he did great things for the league, but it's impossible to ignore his pleasure for segregation in the league's history. Pittsburgh drug trials. So before the steroid era in the MLB, in the 80s there was the cocaine era, which went hand in hand with the NBA's cocaine era, and, well, most of America's cocaine era. In '85, a plethora of Pittsburgh Pirate players, current and former, were called to the Pittsburgh grand jury to testify on a large-scale cocaine scandal. It ended with 11 different Pirates suspended, but all the suspensions were eventually downgraded. It took place sort of behind the scenes, but it still sticks out as one of the biggest scandals in MLB history, even with no effect on the field. Rangers fan. Rangers' Josh Hamilton was just trying to toss a ball into the stands for someone, like every MLB player does after the inning's over. But the man Hamilton threw the ball towards ended up falling over the railing and spilling down violently. You can't see just where he falls to, but it's made all the more horrifying when you see just how far up he was. The man passed away from the fall in a horrific accident that must have been insanely hard on Josh Hamilton. Jose Fernandez. One of the most bone-chilling moments in sports history, the Jose Fernandez incident never fails to give me goosebumps. In 2016, in the middle of the season, young pitching ace Jose Fernandez passed away in a tragic boating accident. He was a bright young stud on the Marlins, and he was a huge loss to the entire league. The death was a heartfelt one, but what always gets me is the first game the Marlins played after his death. D. Gordon, a close friend of Fernandez, led the game off with a solo home run that let out all the feels for everyone. It was Gordon's only home run of the season. $10-cent beer night. Now, if you want a real good, in-depth explanation of 10-cent beer night, there's this one video I saw this one time that's really good about it. Check it out. But 10-cent beer night is a pretty similar one to Disco Demolition Night, with a promotion gone wrong. And this time, we're giving away full-size beers for just 10 cents to anyone who wanted some. As you can imagine, this got out of hand, with multiple streakers, people overtaking the concession stands, and an all-out riot. The game ended without being finished, but that just made the drunk fans more mad, who stayed on the field for hours as the players were escorted off. The baseball diamond had to be tear gassed, with the SWAT team coming in for crowd control. And there's so much more amazingly funny things that I can't get into that I have in my video. The Abyss. Ray Chapman. I'm just going to copy in right here my short about Ray Chapman that I've previously posted. But coincidentally, Ray was actually that same shortstop from the Ray Caldwell story. The only MLB player to die in a game. If we rewind way back to the 1920s, the world's a completely different place. But one thing that's almost the same is baseball. And in 1920, the Indians were taking on the Yankees at the Polo Grounds. And tragically, Indians star shortstop Ray Chapman would become the first and only MLB player to die in a game. Chapman stepped into the box to bat against pitcher Carl May, no helmet on and ready to hit. May rubbed the ball in some dirt, spat on it, and threw it as hard as he could. The ball drilled Chapman in the side of the head. According to eyewitnesses, Chapman began to bleed out of his ear before stumbling around and passing out. He would die a few hours later from brain damage. Chapman's death would cause the MLB to ban spitballs, but players still weren't required to wear batting helmets for another 30 years. John McSherry. So, we've seen the only player to die on the field, but he isn't the only person to. It's often hard for fans to remember that the people umpiring games are real people. But this 1996 game was an all-too-real reminder of just that fact. Umpire John McSherry had what could only be described as a massive heart attack on the field, collapsing and passing away. It was a tragically memorable day in the MLB as the only non-player to die on field. Luckily, this and Chapman's incident serve as the only deaths in Major League games. Wilson Ramos kidnapping. Longtime MLB catcher Wilson Ramos is a highly regarded veteran player who's paved a solid career for himself. But he's gone through something that most people could never possibly imagine. Visiting Venezuela when he was 24, Ramos was worth millions already. But he didn't feel that way when he was stuffed into the back of a black SUV and whisked away, being kidnapped somewhere into the Venezuelan night. Ramos was lost, being searched for 2 whole days until he was finally discovered, a large group of people being behind the kidnapping. Kidnappers knew insane amounts about Ramos's life, and had a neighbor to Ramos who had been stalking him day and night. Luckily, Ramos was found pretty unharmed physically, but obviously with mental trauma forever. He's the only pro athlete in American sport to be kidnapped, and carries with him one of the MLB's most dark moments. Clemente's plane. Roberto Clemente is an MLB legend for so many things he did off the field and on it. But his passing in the middle of his career remains one of the sadder moments in baseball, if not for perfectly showing what Clemente's life was about. He was a giver, and his death was a factor of him giving. After a massive earthquake in Nicaragua, Clemente simply needed to help. He found a small plane, got a pilot, and began flying relief shipments from the US to Nicaragua. It wasn't his first trip, but on one flight, carrying too much weight into bad weather, Clemente's plane crashed, and his body was never recovered. He died in the midst of an amazing career, iconically finishing with exactly 3,000 hits. Thurman Munson. Thurman Munson was a Yankees star who played in the 70s. He was a solid player who was very close with his family. So close, in fact, that he got his own pilot's license to be able to easily fly back and forth to home. But eventually, this extensive flying caught up to Thurman. In 1979, he crashed his plane while practicing land-ins. The 2 other people in the plane survived the incident, but Thurman did not, leaving our hearts missing him forever. Tyler Skaggs. This is one of the more recent additions to the list for the final piece of the iceberg. This Angels pitcher is one of the most recent athletes to pass away, and it came dead in the middle of the 2019 season. On the road, Skaggs texted the Angels team doctor, asking for painkillers for an injury. The next day, police found him dead in his hotel room, with tons of oxycodone around him, along with a strange white powder. The death was ruled an accident, but it got worse later. Autopsy reports went on to reveal he had fentanyl, alcohol, and oxy in his system, providing a deadly mixture. Just a few months ago, the ex-Angels employee responsible was sentenced to 22 years in prison. And that brings us to the end of my very own MLB Iceberg. I did make this one originally, so make sure you guys let me know what you thought in the comments. This storied sport definitely has its fair share of tragedies that have occurred. I'm also sorry for all the PG-13 measures I have to take on these videos. I just really don't want any more getting age restricted because it basically kills their growth. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you check out another one right here, and goodbye. I just found this brick wall. I didn't move. I just found a brick wall.